everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Veritas Fact Finding Series. And today I'm joined by my special guest, Howard Green.
Thanks, Anthony. Great to be with you again. Yeah.
We're back on the ground to speak with industry professionals in an unscripted, candid video format to discover how we can make better investment decisions. If you're watching and you like what you hear, give us a like and follow us at www.veritascorp.com. Quick disclaimer. This broadcast is not to be taken as investment advice, and participants and or employees of the Veritas Group of companies may own securities discussed in this broadcast. And while we love all our guests, and Howard in particular, this session may contain forward-looking statements, investment opinions, and comments that, believe it or not, we may not agree with. Now, isn't this layout perfect?
This is fabulous. I feel like we're hosting Wide World of Sports or something.
This is like, well, as we said, this is kind of like Howard Cosell.
Yeah, no, exactly. Howard Cosell. Yeah.
But today we're discussing a topic that feels particularly relevant given the environment investors and business leaders are navigating today. We live in a world of geopolitical instability, trade tensions, inflation, government debt, disruption with AI. The financial markets seem to swing from fear to euphoria within the hour sometimes. And in periods like these, the most valuable lesson often comes not from the theories, but from people who've actually managed through crisis. And my guest today, Howard Green, one of Canada's most respected business journalists, the author of Gimme, a Crisis, in a room with Global Banker Rick Waugh. The book provides a rare behind-the-scenes look at a former Scotiabank CEO, Rick Waugh, and how one of Canada's most successful banking leaders navigated uncertainty, financial shocks, and moments where the wrong decision could have had enormous consequences. What struck me, Howard, reading this book, is that it's not really a book about banking. It's a book about leadership and what it takes to lead, temperament, judgment, risk, and how you make those tough decisions when you don't have all the facts. One theme that comes up repeatedly, of course, is his ability to manage risk and how he thinks about downside risk first before he thinks about upside capture. So this book asks a different question. How do great leaders survive long enough to benefit from opportunity? That's what we're going to explore today. So, Howard, always right from the top.
Yeah.
Why this book? Why now?
Yeah, well, it was unplanned, first of all. I never thought I'd be writing this book. I've known Rick since, since he got the job as Scotia's CEO back at the end of 2003, beginning of 2004.
Right.
And I used to have him on the show on BNN, which is where we know each other. And you said it's not a book about banking, and that's an interesting observation because I didn't write it for bank nerds. And I say that to people. You don't even have to care about banking to read this book and get something out of it. And that's actually how I approach all of my books. I want them to be accessible. I don't want them to be simplistic, but I want them to be accessible to any reader. And so, I think what's really amazing about this story, and you pretty much touched on it, it's really unprecedented to get inside one of these Canadian banks. Now, this is a former CEO, but even still, can you think of any former CEOs of Canadian banks? I mean, you never get inside these places.
No.
And so, part of it, I think, is a relationship. I developed a strong relationship, not friends, but a strong relationship, cordial relationship, friendly relationship, but not personal friends. And all of my books, actually, this is the fourth one, have really been the fruit of long-term relationships with people where they've trusted me to share information that they have not shared with other people, like the global financial crisis. What was going on during the global financial crisis? What was going on during the default of Argentina, actually the 9th default of Argentina since independence, during the bailout of the Dominican Republic, all crises that Rick was in the middle of and managed to stick handle. And I think you raised some interesting points in your introduction about his approach to risk.
Yep.
Always know your downside first. Don't get stars in your eyes about a 10-bagger before you know how much you can lose. I mean, look at, he wanted opportunities, and he was a risk taker as well as a risk manager, but he looked at risk first. And I think that probably, well, I know it came out of the fact that when he first went to Scotiabank and he arrived in Toronto,
Yeah.
Bob McIntosh, who you may remember, he was the head of the Canadian Bankers Association. He was an executive, he's now passed away, but he was an executive at Scotia, very thoughtful man, a PhD, one of the few PhDs in Canadian banking. But he told Rick, I'm never going to be the CEO of Scotiabank.
Right.
If you want to be CEO of Scotiabank, learn credit, because credit, i.e. risk, is the lifeblood of this organization. And Scotia historically was a bank obsessed with credit and getting credit right. The morning meeting was sacrosanct. Do we approve that one? Do we not approve that one? Do we yank that one?
Right.
Rick,
And he would have his sleeves rolled up and he'd be right in there.
oh yeah, going through credits at home
Yeah.
at night. He said, ask my wife. I'd bring home a briefcase full of credits. He put on the juke. He collects jukeboxes of all things.
Is that right?
Yeah, and he's
I feel like
playing
something.
45s. He's a child of the 60s, I guess, and it's all sort of 60s rock, when I looked at the stuff in there.
Yes.
And he put on the jukebox or put on the baseball game or the basketball game at night, go through those credits. What's real, what's not real, what's a yes, what's a no. And that's what he learned early on at Scotiabank, which I think really formed the foundation for how he approached everything in banking.
And Howard, what this book, and we've also done another fact finder on Hunter Harrison and the book you wrote, The Railroader, is your ability to tell stories. And I know that comes from your background, starting out writing children's stories, right?
Yeah. Children's
and I love that.
News for children.
Yes.
Adolescents. Yeah. Well, I started in hard news, the local supper hour news, doing forest fires, accidents, murders, legislature, whatever. And then in '83, I moved to Toronto because I got a job hosting and field producing a children's news magazine, a weekly children's news magazine on CBC called What's New. We had a huge audience back then, like 400,000 people a week, which is, that's more than the national now. Because that national children compressed. But it was an after school thing. And we had to tell the week's news or discuss issues for a youth audience in a way that wouldn't turn them off. So there were two things I learned. One, you can't condescend to a teenager because they'll run away. I don't want to listen to this guy.
Yeah.
And you have to speak in a way that doesn't assume prior knowledge. Like they didn't know where Lebanon was or Nicaragua was. Half of the adult population didn't know. And they would watch because they wouldn't understand the national at night. So we'd put up a map, say where it was, and we'd explain it, or what the deficit was,
yes,
what the national debt was, what acid rain was, because that was the big thing then between Mulrooney and Reagan before the FTA, which predated NAFTA, free trade agreement.
Right.
All of those things. And so, I took that sensibility of how to communicate to that audience when I went to BNN. And so, it's because we knew CEOs were watching.
Right.
Finance department. Harper was watching. He had it on in the office there. Didn't really come on the show, but he had it on. He came on once, actually. But or talking to guys like you about BioVale's earnings, when you would come in and talk about stuff like that, or Nortel,
right?
And what we're doing now, I'm speaking in a way that I hope is accessible to everybody, just like I sort of feel like Buffett and the late Charlie Munger talk to their audience. I mean, I'm nowhere near them, but they speak simply, but not simplistically.
Yeah,
and that's how I write books.
And I think that's a secret sauce, and that's the key that's going to continue to attract listeners, continue to attract readers.
Well, because I know you guys would call bullshit on me if I did it the other way, right?
You helped us. We've hired you to help our guys become better presenters, become better storytellers, because that's what you got to do. And I, for those listening, that's a superpower that Howard can really help you with. But I think that comes out here in this story about Rick, because he starts out as a teller in Winnipeg. Tell us where he came from, because that's going to help define sort of where he ended up when he was CEO and what he went through.
Right. Good question. He has never forgotten his Winnipeg roots.
Yeah.
He is very attached to Winnipeg. In fact, I went with him to Winnipeg, to University of Manitoba, where he got his undergrad, and we had a couple of book events there in the fall. And the city loves him, you know, it was a big event. And anyway, his roots, very working class. His dad was a firefighter. And, you know, he's brought to tears about the memory of his dad.
Wow.
His dad died young, and it was close to both of his parents. All sorts of family members lived in a very small home. You know, he and his brother share a room. Their grandparents lived there.
Sure.
It's over a little place. But you know, his dad was shot down during the war,
Wow.
burned. He was in a plane over Egypt, burned. Yet he became a firefighter.
Afterwards.
And he fought some of the most famous fires in Winnipeg, as Rick described, falling through roofs, falling off trucks.
Oh.
You know, brave guy. Said he, you know, originally was going to be a cop, but he didn't want to give his friends tickets. You know, so he became a firefighter. And so I think Rick gets that extroverted, friendly side. You know, he puts his arm around. Sure, I'll give you a loan. But then his mom was tough and told you, you know, she rooted out the BS, and it didn't take it from anybody. And he got that sort of tougher side, he thinks, from his mom, you know, and that's maybe the ice in his veins,
Yes.
you know, when he's the black-hatted banker going to collect on the loan.
Yes.
We want the money back now, you know, so, you know, yeah, we want your business, but don't take us for granted. So anyway, he got hired by Scotiabank. He was offered a job in Calgary as an accountant in the oil and gas industry. He thought, but, you know, I'll be a nobody there. You know, I won't be running anything. And not that he had a design to be CEO, but Scotia actually let him take a trip of Europe, hitchhike around Europe before he came back to work. So he thought, I'll take it. And it's in Winnipeg. It's $7,400 a year. I know Winnipeg. It's in a strip mall that I know. I'll take the job. He's there 3 weeks. Toronto calls. We want you in Toronto. Never been on a plane before.
Wow.
Comes to Toronto. 44 King West, the old building, pre-Scotia Plaza. He moved in, you know, and within a short period of time, he's working in the bank's investment department.
Right.
Like he's 25 years old, investing for the bank in their pension fund and so forth. And he's doing that risk analysis. And interestingly enough, the phone rings one day, and it's Cedric Ritchie, who was a legendary CEO of Scotia, 2 CEOs before Rick. Mm-hmm. You know, a guy who was a teller as well in New Brunswick, where, you know, the bank's the St. John River. And Richie calls him up and says, come on down. And he says, what's EBITDA?
Should have called me.
Richie never heard the term EBITDA, earnings before interest, taxes.
It's an amortization.
Right.
Yeah.
But Rick, as an analyst, said, and as a credit guy and as a risk guy, you had to follow EBITDA. Not that it was earnings, because
Right.
Charlie Munger calls it bullshit earnings.
100%.
And I said that to Rick. He said, I never called it earnings. He said, Rick. He said, but that's where the cash is coming from.
Sure.
And the cash is what's going to pay back the loan.
Right.
So as a banker, he was fixated on EBITDA. And Richie wanted to know what EBITDA was. Anyway, but they developed a great mutual respect over time, and eventually he got on the track to become an executive. He ran the main branch at 31, which was huge. He had 400 or 500 people under him.
Yep.
Main branch. Got to know all the bigwigs in Toronto. You know, all the financiers and so forth. You know, Larry Tannenbaum's father, Max Tannenbaum, was one of his clients. Larry told me that, you know, his dad, who's passed away 40 odd years ago, saw him as a future CEO of the bank, but never saw it happen. And then he became an executive in New York, turned down Trump for a loan, and you know, the rest is history. Came back to Toronto and rose up the ranks.
So now let's go into the room with Global Banker. And we're going to go through that big shock, which was the financial crisis.
Yeah.
We'll spend quite a bit of time talking about that here, because that's when really his superpowers, Rick's, came through.
Right.
Take us through some of the things that you learned that perhaps, because what's magical about the book as well is that as you started out by saying, you got the chance to go, let's call it behind the sheets
Yeah, yeah,
behind the covers.
yeah.
Underneath
Under
the
the covers, but not with anything, you know, like
I
that.
understood.
There's no sex scenes in the
No,
book.
there's no.
You know, maybe the next one. I don't know.
That's why it's not a global
Yeah,
bestseller.
yeah, right.
That may be the next thing. I think that's a good switch.
Maybe for my foray into fiction, you know. But
Maybe write about maybe a porn star or something.
well, geez, you know.
Anyway, all right, tell the story.
Okay.
Let's go behind under the covers in the Great Financial Crisis.
Okay, so, you know, I am actually going to reach for another character because not only did I talk to Rick extensively for this book, but I talked to a wide range of people who either worked with him, worked under him, or intersected with him. And when I say intersected, I mean governors of the Bank of Canada like David Dodge, Mark Carney, or Jamie Dimon at JP Morgan, but also the key executives under him. And, you know, one of whom was Sabi Marwa, his CFO and then COO, basically the number two at the bank, and Bob Brooks, who's since passed away, who was treasurer at the bank. And I had the good fortune to speak with Bob not long before he died at length. And it was harrowing what this man told me because the you know, treasury at the bank is really the engine room of the bank.
It's the blood.
Yeah, you know, you're managing the balance sheet of the bank, what's coming in, what's going out, and so forth, and making sure you're solvent. And during the crisis, you know, he was watching all of the terms shrink, you know, from, you know, 180 days to 90 days to 60 days to 30 days to overnight. And, you know, commercial paper, you raise money through commercial paper. And Scotia actually was different than the other major Canadian banks in that even though it was third in terms of market capitalization and other factors, it was fifth in terms of deposits. Because of its history. And so, you know, in the Maritimes, and it didn't have the deposit base, and they focused more on raising money from the markets
in order capital markets focused,
in order to fund operations, to fund the loan book and so forth. They have a very big loan book in the United States, but they didn't have that because during the crisis, you know, the bond market froze, U.S. dollar. You couldn't get U.S. dollars. They needed U.S. dollars to fund the U.S. loan book and so forth. And he was saying, I went home at night wondering whether the paper would roll the next day. And I'm thinking, Jesus, this is a Canadian bank. And we heard how many times that we were the soundest system in the world. And really we were, and I guess Australia was as well. But we were bigger. But it was close. You know, and there were a lot of and Rick he disputed that. That was you know, contentious actually between, you know, as I was asking him about it, you know, I'd spoken to Bob. I said, well, Bob said, and he said, well, that's Bob's view. But I had the
I thought we were fine.
Right. I had the big view. I was the CEO. I had the big view, and the main part of the bank was in Canada, is in Canada. And a huge part of the Canadian bank is the mortgage portfolio. He once said to me, mortgages, that's 20% of, you know, our revenue, and that keeps the lights on. That pays the overhead. And he said that is stable because you know, it's generally the mortgage book is more than 50% loan to value, or 50-50 loan to value average. So he was confident that the Canadian, you know, the main Canadian bank was going to survive. Yet, at the federal level, they were meeting Carney all the time. You know, there were, in Rick's calendar, there were multiple meetings with the other bank CEOs and Carney and OSFI and CDIC. What's happening? What's going on? And it was, and Rick said, look, we could do this. We could all speak candidly together in front of these people. We were not colluding because we were in front of our political authorities and regulatory authorities. We weren't doing it behind their back, but they were calling these meetings, or we were having these meetings often here in downtown or on conference calls. And, you know, Carney was quarterbacking those meetings.
Wow.
That is the word Gord Nixon, the former CEO of Royal Bank, said to me. I interviewed him for the book. I interviewed Bill Down from BMO.
Okay.
I spent 3 hours over breakfast with Bill Down. I mean, it was incredible how much time he gave me. But Gord said Carney quarterbacked those meetings. Of course, he's our prime minister now. And so Rick was in the middle of all of this.
So let's take it now on what I think is most remembered by investors about Rick's tenure at Scotia. And he made Canada, or Scotiabank, Canada's most international bank.
Right.
By expanding into Central and South America, right?
Right.
And
well, a lot of that, to be fair, I mean, he went with that strategy and perhaps expanded in certain respects, but that started to be established before he became CEO, through the gold business.
Yes.
They were in the gold business, storing it, trading it from the late 50s through the 60s. And then, for central banks and in other countries like Peru, and then Peru would say, hey, you're storing our gold. Why don't you lend our steel company $3 million? And that's how, all that started. And then, bit by bit later into retail banking, Richie, Godso, and Rick, kind of collectively built up that international business over time.
And so when they, but during his tenure, RBC kind of became Canada's dominant franchise.
Yeah.
TD was a bit of a market darling. And then BNS did well, but since then there's been question marks after Rick left. And so how would you characterize that and from what Rick left and what's become?
Yeah. Well, that's an interesting observation and a fair observation. Certainly, when Rick left in 2014, Brian Porter took over.
Yep.
And Brian, a different kind of guy, and I have a cordial relationship with Brian, just like
you interviewed him for the book as well.
No, I didn't interview him for the book, but I interviewed him a number of times previously. And when he was chief risk officer, and then when he took over from Rick, and so forth. And actually at town halls at Scotiabank earlier in his tenure. But he had a different view. Times change. Rick was a very gregarious leader, people person, a walk around, on the floor manager. Brian much more introverted, a different kind of a Harvard Business School guy, different take. Technology imperatives came in that weren't necessarily there when and frankly Scotia lagged on technology. David Dodge was on the board after he was governor of the Bank of Canada. He said, "Oh, totally, we were way behind." And for a long time they poo-pooed ATMs at the bank. They poo-pooed Visa. Really? They were late on Visa in the 70s. They were late on ATMs. They had the crappiest ATMs of any of the banks. They weren't going to they were known as the cheap bank. And Rick would kind of wear that as a badge. We're cheap,
Well, he came from Winnipeg,
town, right? And Richie was that way, and Sabi was that way, and Sabi said it's other people's money, and so. But Brian actually, I know he bristled at that whole cheap thing. He didn't like that, but he had a different management approach, and a lot of people didn't like it. The bank didn't do well. Stock wise during that period. There was a significant cultural change. I think it's fair to say during that period, during the Rick era and previously, it was kind of known as a family culture bank.
Yes. And
that changed. That totally changed. Now there's a guy named Scott Thompson who's been in the seat for about 3 years. He was on the board previously, CEO of Finning previously, not a lifer at a Canadian bank, although he had done some banking at Goldman, I think.
Industrial guy.
But, the bank, and I've spoken with Scott a few times, but not specifically for the book. But I saw him at an event a couple of weeks ago. Anyway, he told me he liked the book. But, I think he's trying to straddle, he's trying to reach back to the Rick era a bit for some of
Thompson,
that.
you think?
Yeah, I think so. For that cultural piece and the
Interesting.
way to run it, but with Brian's approach to things like technology and so because we're in an AI world now, right?
Sure.
And the banks are all running like crazy towards becoming the best at AI.
Mhm.
And Rick, of course, is an older guy, and perhaps this is a bit of a generational thing, and we've talked about that. And I
Yes.
feel it myself.
Yes.
But he's very suspicious of algorithms and AI. And he shut down a big trade during the crisis. That's in the book. That was relying on an algorithm, and so an algorithm can be wrong.
Yes.
What it's programmed for, and I know how they're programmed, and they all have biases. All
Right.
algorithms and all AI will have a bias.
Sure.
Right. So he said, I'd rather have a pilot flying the plane. And I kind of feel
An
the same
autopilot.
way.
Yeah.
Like if there are things that it can do to improve processes and so forth, that's different. But I think you have to embrace it, but you also have to somehow get your arms around the risk of it. And I don't think, he believes that we fully understand the risks of it. But back to leadership, Scott is now, I think, trying to be a blend of Rick and Brian to bring back the more hands-on familial culture of Scotia, but with a hard-headed approach. Rick confessed to me maybe he wasn't disciplined enough on some things.
Yeah.
He had a heart for people.
Porter would have said that he had to make the bank more efficient.
Right. And I'm going to change this bank.
Yeah.
Right. And so anyway, but he would have had the approval of the board to do that,
Yeah.
and he was chosen for that.
And that's why
Rick didn't choose him for the job.
That's why people. It's so important to study history, and very little work is often done on the people at the time.
Right.
Because BNS is where it is today.
Yeah.
Because of things that Rick did.
Yeah.
And the CEOs prior.
Right. Oh, totally.
Decisions that were made. And
Yeah.
I think that's relevant as we now look at where we are and the decisions that were made. And so for years, investors questioned Mexico, Peru,
Right.
Chile, Colombia,
Right.
the complexity of this international bank, which was BNS.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because today,
Yeah.
what is Canada thinking of doing? We need to go away from
Diversify.
the US.
Yeah.
And let's start thinking back. Let's start thinking about other things.
Well, yeah, and it's a
interesting?
very interesting question. It is a very interesting question because under Rick, Scotia was in 55 countries.
Yeah.
I mean, they were the bank in Haiti. They're not anymore. Brian Porter sold Haiti
Yeah.
in, I think, 2017.
Yeah.
He started to pull back on international exposure or focus it more on Chile, on the big four, Peru, Chile, Mexico, and actually Colombia,
Yeah.
which was something that Rick bought Peru, Rick bought Colombia. Peru's worked out great. Colombia, not so much, because the political leadership didn't go the way they thought.
Yeah.
Mexico's very strong.
Yeah.
So they're top 5 in Mexico, they're top 5 in Peru, they're top 5 in Chile. And they still have 30% of the deposits in the Caribbean, across the Caribbean.
Mm-hmm.
And the Caribbean, when you add it all up, is a fairly large population.
And
but
economy,
they're the major bank really in Jamaica. And they were in Jamaica before they were in Toronto in the late 1800s because of the rum.
How about that for history?
Yeah, the rum and lumber trade between I'm a Nova Scotia boy. The rum and lumber trade between Nova Scotia and the Caribbean.
Some investors in BNS today may not even know that it's called Bank of Nova Scotia.
No, exactly. It's just like when I wrote the TD book, there's this story in the TD book, which was my first. It was really about the big push into the U.S., and it comes around to your point about diversification.
Yes.
But a cruise ship came into St. John from the States, and a bunch of Americans got off the cruise ship and said, "Hey, look, they got TD up here too." People in the U.S. didn't know it meant Toronto Dominion.
But TD wants that in a way.
No, they don't really.
Really?
No, they don't. They don't want Toronto Dominion on the banners in the United States.
They don't want it to be. They want the customer to not know that it's Toronto.
Right.
TD.
Yeah, just
Yeah,
like
okay.
RBC.
Exactly.
Sponsors the golf tournaments, the Masters or whatever. What's RBC? Royal Bank of Canada?
Right.
It's RBC. Like
Right.
UBS. They're these sort of almost,
Yes.
code
Ubiquitous.
names,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. So anyway.
But the US, you're talking about versus international.
Yes.
And so, Brian refocused. Scott has done even more. Scott Thompson, the current CEO. Now it's Canada, US, and Mexico.
Right.
And I mean, they still have the footprint in some of these other countries, but it's probably half of what it was when Rick ran the bank. I don't know the precise number of countries, but it's much fewer. And Rick wonders about that. He respects Scott's. They know each other, have a good relationship. He respects Scott's position, and he's the CEO now, and he gets to make the decisions. And it's a different world. And he has bought 14.9% of Key Bank in Ohio, which is a major bank. Rick tried to buy in Ohio during the crisis, you'll remember, and then TARP came in and he said, we can't buy it. But they were very close to buying the 10th biggest deposit base in the United States at the time. And, maybe they should have bought it, but there was too much risk at the time. They didn't know. And so Scott has focused it even more. But Rick wondered, he says, show me one Canadian bank that's done well in the U.S. He almost jumps out of his chair. When you look at the ROE, TD invested huge there under Ed, $20 billion, but the ROE is way lower than it is here. And it will probably,
same with RBC, all of them.
It will probably never be as high as it is here.
Yes.
Because, you've got the sunk costs of 150 years here.
And an oligopoly.
So, mind you, Gordon Nixon said to me, we compete like hell here. We're more competitive. Sure. We're more competitive than the Americans. I'd never heard anybody say that. But he said that to me from his car. He's talking to me from his car on Zoom, trying to drive. Anyway,
what a fascinating perspective you get on business here.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Talk to these guys on the phone.
Oh yeah,
see them live.
Yeah,
have dinner with them, have breakfast.
Yeah,
and I want to just bring up something which would ties back to our last fact finder, which talked about Hunter Harrison, and he's famous for his intensity, right?
Yeah,
you called the book The Railroader.
Yeah,
for a reason. Railroader.
Yeah,
and so. Let's maybe compare the two, contrast, and extract what you take away from it.
Yeah, it's funny. They met once.
Is that right?
Guys. Yeah, because they were on Harper.
They were both big personalities.
But very, very different. Hunter was sort of in your face, funny, terrifying, intimidating. Kind of a savant Rain Man-like figure when it came to running railroads, how to move boxcars. And arguably Rick was like that with banking, but much more sort of gregarious, never kind of this scary figure. Although, he was tough on his reports, his main reports. One of them spoke to the Globe when he left and, at the exit interview and described Rick's management style as bad parenting. Especially if, one of those guys, and they were all guys, were running a division that he used to run, right? Running international or running wealth or whatever. He was tough. And he expected, and he joked when I said that to him, bad parenting, eh? And he said, yeah, sometimes your kids need a talking to, that sort of thing. But vastly different from Hunter.
Yes.
Hunter would explode, and be profane and yelling and screaming, at CSX, the last railroad he ran, he had a huge blow up there. I mean, he was the guy brought in, it was kind of like Yosemite Sam brought in with all guns blazing to fix that railroad fast. And he was a sick man. And it was a hedge fund that brought him in, and the board was kind of in a jam. They knew he was sick, but they didn't know the extent of his illness.
Yeah.
And they couldn't do anything about it because the stock rose 24% on the day the rumor came out.
That he was going to be there. Yeah.
So you pull that rug out.
Complete.
Fait accompli. It was going to happen. But, they said to him, Hunter, you need sensitivity training at
He probably
CSX.
said, fuck you.
He did. He said, ain't gonna happen. That's, his word was, it's bullshit.
Is that
That's
right?
much bullshit.
I like that.
Anyway, so they were vastly different, but they were both people who got results.
Mm-hmm.
Hunter was brought into CN by none other than Michael Sabia, who's now clerk of the Privy Council under Carney. Sabia was CFO of Canadian National Railway under Paul Tellier in the 90s after they privatized it. Very successful privatization, but they weren't railroad guys. They weren't railroaders.
No.
Hunter was extraordinarily impressed with what they had done, but he thought there was only a certain point
they've reached
that
the
they could take.
of
They
the
could take it.
complexity.
Yeah. So they bought Illinois Central, which he was running out of Chicago, gave CN the line down to, the New Orleans coast, made it a NAFTA railway. That was the map, the map on the wall, Sabia said, the vision. And they brought him in, and he was a hard ass. And he made no apologies for it, although he bitched and moaned about how people would, say he was a mean guy. I asked him on the air, "Are you a mean guy?" I said, "Mean guy? No mean guy. What the hell? You right to
with his cowboy hat on, right?
Like days before he died, our last conversation at the Breakers in Palm Beach.
Yes,
he said, "I ain't a mean guy. CN brought me in because they knew I could fucking make them a lot of money." And he was right. The boards all hired him to do what he knew how to do.
Yeah.
And he was tough. But if you were willing to learn from him, he was a mentor. Mm-hmm. And Rick was a mentor to many. And women. There's the last chapter of the book, Gimme, Crisis, is about advancing women at the bank. I mean, it is appalling how women were treated at these companies in our lifetime. Mm-hmm. That they constitute more than half of the staff of these organizations, and that changed during the war. You needed the people, but until this is in here. Until when he joined the bank, women were not permitted on the executive floor of the bank. There was no women's washroom on the executive floor of the bank. How's that for a hint?
This is 2003.
No, when he joined in 1970.
Oh, at the beginning.
Yeah,
Sorry. I thought
and so, but it was slow, the change. And if you were a woman, you could not be part of the pension plan, the company pension plan at Scotiabank until 1967. I was 8 years old in 1967. My mother was in the workforce in 1967. I'm thinking about, she passed away recently, and I'm thinking about what. Fortunately, my dad earned a good living, but if you were a single woman and you didn't get a pension,
wow,
and your peers were getting, and others weren't much better. Royal didn't bring it in until 1963, and Earl McLaughlin, who ran the bank, Royal, in 1976, when he's asked when is there going to be a woman on the board, there's no women qualified to be on the board. It's like a classic foot in mouth,
Whereas, listen, I have 3 daughters. I think it's women's time right now. I think there's so much opportunity, in sport, in business, etc.
Well,
women.
The other night I emceed the CEO of the Year at the ROM.
Okay.
Greg Hicks from Canadian Tire got it. Great guy.
Sure.
They've done a lot there. You should have him as a guest. Anyway. They have this thing called the Futures Fund scholarships every year, where they pick students from business schools across the country.
Yes.
Give them scholarships, and they're really sharp young people.
Yeah.
Really brainy, well-spoken. 9 out of 10 were women.
Wow.
Young women. Only one guy.
Wow.
That's quite something.
How's that for turning things on its head?
Right.
Literally. All right. Let's take it to today's markets now.
Okay.
And let's imagine that Rick were here.
Yep.
And what do you think would be
We'd
keeping
be
him?
laughing.
Is that right?
Okay, well, he's very funny.
Is he?
Oh yeah.
That's not. I
Oh,
would not have expected
Oh no,
that.
a lot of laughs. But sorry, I interrupted
No,
you.
no,
Yeah.
I'm trying to tee this up for you here to tell us if he were looking at what's going on today with the global the unrest, with the wars that are taking place, with the AI revolution or displacement. What do you think he'd be thinking?
I can boil it down to one word:
Sure.
liquidity. Make sure you got liquidity, which was always, his thing at the bank. That brings me back to Bob Brooks in the engine room, the Treasury Department of the bank. The bank needed to make sure it had liquidity. And that was what Rick said to him on the phone in the run up to the crisis, just as all this shitstorm was gathering. He was at a meeting in Europe, I think, with global bankers, and he saw the guys from Iceland and the guys from Ireland and some Americans and Brits, and he says, there's a bad vibe in this room. I don't know what's going on. But he calls up Bob Brooks and he says, I don't know what's going on, but make sure we got lots of liquidity.
Liquidity's like oxygen.
It's oxygen.
You don't have it.
Yeah.
You don't know how much you need it until you don't have it.
Until you don't have it. And so, I've talked to Rick a number of times since the book came out. We've done events, we've done interviews like this and so forth, and I've been on the phone with him. And, we're always talking about the markets, and he's still very involved in the markets and investing. And, he said, markets are going up, and I might be wrong for a while here, but
He's concerned.
But there's, you always want some liquidity. And so I think that's something now that's the risk manager in them.
Yep.
Right. How much is the question, I guess. You'd know better than I. But Bob Brooks said, during the crisis, I wanted to make sure we had, as far as liquidity went, 20% of the U.S. balance sheet.
Wow.
Because of their big loan book in the United States. Heavy lenders to cable in the U.S.
Yes.
Like TD.
Yes.
Hospitals in, Tennessee. Rick's got a steamer on the Mississippi named for him.
Really?
One of these companies, the Richard E. Waugh. You can look it up on YouTube. You can see it creeping down the Mississippi, this
with the
steamboat.
boat.
Yeah,
wow.
with the wheel. Yeah.
So I think I want to extract something from you, if I can put it that way, that to leave our listeners and those watching, because you've interviewed so many CEOs. You've written about at least two of them in the books, right? Four. All four are about CEOs.
Well, yeah, I guess the Bronfman one, Charles was co-chair. It wasn't CEO.
But definitely books about leadership. At the end of the day,
sure.
As much as they're about the companies themselves.
Yeah.
And here, many of those that are going to be watching are interviewing and meeting CEOs and management teams all the time.
Yeah.
How do you think that, if you could provide us with sort of, here's the three things you should ask for or look for to determine that, look, this CEO, this leadership team has what it takes to manage through a crisis, to be able to see the opportunities. That, you see what I mean?
Yeah, no, I do. And I fully believe, actually, that all of these books, certainly TD's, certainly Railroader, certainly Gimme a Crisis, the latest one, are case studies on leadership.
Right.
They could, I'm talking my own book here.
Do that.
But yeah, exactly, as they say. But they could be case studies at business schools or for anybody who's trying to look at leadership. But I think, you want transparency, you want integrity. That's the top thing. You want integrity. You want honest people. People are going to be honest with you, and you want people who are going to ask penetrating questions. Rick was fantastic at, and still is, at the penetrating question. Why does this company want to bank with us? Why do they want to leave that other bank? Why is that, term in the term sheet so important to them?
Yes.
What am I missing here? There's a ton of questions, and I list a ton of those kinds of questions that he would have asked, and that the credit team would have asked, Stephen Hart was one of the people who I interviewed quite extensively for the book, and he was the chief risk officer of the bank, previously chief credit officer, and he had a whole other ton of list of questions.
Right.
So it's all that work. It's hard work. You know, it's 24/7.
But it's hard, right? So many meetings are happening Zoom.
Yeah.
Or,
Which he hates.
Right.
Because he likes to walk around. He likes to see people.
Right.
It says, you know, the human reaction is information.
Correct.
If he's across from a guy or a gal and he asks them one of those penetrating questions,
Yes.
and they physically react in a certain way,
100%.
you know,
Yes.
they might have had their Zoom camera off.
That's right. That's right.
Or, oh, I didn't hear you that time.
We have
You
a
know?
document, we put together the 10,
Right.
10 things you,
Right.
the 10 ways you can know if someone's lying.
Right. Boots on the ground.
Yeah.
And you know, the thing with Hunter, the thing with Rick, the thing with you know, like an Ed Clark or a Keith Gray, who was an executive who built Green Line and
Yep.
gave, you know, bought Waterhouse for them, gave them the money to buy Canada Trust, and then Ed and
Yeah.
took off. Couldn't bullshit them.
Right.
These are the kind of people you can't bullshit.
Okay.
That's the kind of leader you want, you know?
And would you say it's important? Because one thing we always look for is when you as the interviewee
Yeah.
are asking, or the interviewer, sorry, are asking tough questions that may make the CEO or the management team uncomfortable. How
Yeah.
they react to that, I think, is really key, right?
Yeah. Well, you know, I had to ask a lot of CEOs on the air whether, with all due respect, they should resign,
Nice.
you know. You know, it's never a nice thing to do because it's another human being.
Yes.
So I was always respectful of the fact that I had another human being across the table, but I was the surrogate for the audience, for
Yes.
people, you know, so I had to ask. And, you know,
It's not personal.
No,
I
I'd say,
always
well,
think
it's
not personal.
yeah, I mean, it gives me no pleasure to have to ask this, but, you know, so I try to frame it in a way, and I firmly believe you can ask anything if you ask it in the right way.
Yes.
And so, I mean, I've had to ask, you know, going back to that kids show, kids who were sexually abused,
Right.
street criminals, young offenders. I mean, a lot harder cases to talk to than a bank CEO, to
Yes.
be totally honest with you.
Yes.
A blind girl who's 10 years old, you know, telling me how to use her Braille machine. I mean, that's where I learned to interview people,
Yes.
with these people, you know. So, but I always felt like, okay, the good ones are going to want to answer those questions, those tough questions.
Mhm.
The smart ones show up on the rainy day
Yes.
to answer those questions, because sure as shooting, they're getting harder edged, harder worded questions from big shareholders through investor relations than they ever were from Howard Green,
Nice.
right? If some guy's got, you know, Bill Ackman's got $2 billion on the line,
Yes.
he's ripping your face off.
Yes.
We're not hearing it, but it's happening.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, you know, that's how I thought about it. I thought I have a duty. That's my job. It's a public service, what I'm doing. I'm talking about when I was on the channel or
Yeah.
when I'm
When
writing the
you're
book.
being,
And I have to ask these. And this big shtick between Rick and I about compensation for 20 years, asking about his compensation. And the first time was over at the bank. Before we set up there, and I you know, I was kind of being, well, I asked all of them that, you know, all of them, and the you know, insurance companies, the phone company, whatever.
Yeah, of course.
Don, Lindsay from tech, you know, we're all paid so much. And it was a social, you know, kind of a social issue to talk about, right?
Yeah.
Particularly with income inequality and wealth inequality. And when I asked him, you know, I was being provocative. I said, you know, this bank's been around for 150 years. Your big job is not to screw it up, not to drive it into the ditch. And hey, that kind of lit Rick's fuse, and he got defensive with me, which he didn't want, and his team wouldn't want him to get defensive publicly.
That's not good.
And we broke for commercial. And he slapped me on the knee and he said,
Come on.
"You got me." He said, but then, you know, it's sort of been a thing between us for years discussing it.
That's good.
And every time I see him in every public event, he's saying, he always asks me about my compensation. You know, it's like, anyway.
But those are good.
They're fair questions. It's public information, you know, and I write about it in the epilogue. So, But
it's a clear sign though, whatever makes the management team get antsy.
right.
That's a
Well,
sign.
they're all, I remember the late Adam Zimmerman, who was chair and CEO of Noranda. Remember Adam?
Of course.
He said, companies operate with public consent.
Hmm.
They all get an incorporation charter from the government.
Yes.
And the banks, are all, part of that. These are public companies.
Mhm.
And the public, not just the shareholders, are stakeholders because it's these communities.
And
And
they have, in many ways, the banks, they have fiduciary duty
right,
to, the deposit
Right.
holders, to
yeah,
the many customers they have.
Yeah.
It's a different kind of business.
right. And to be fair, their compensation, which is high, not as high as some of the others, that get published every year, and
Right.
they don't have the place in Canadian society that the banks have, although they're starting to creep up. Dave Mackay's now in the 20s, and so
We'll leave that for another discussion.
yeah.
So let's wrap it up how we always like
Yeah.
to wrap it up. A book that, aside from the 4 books you've written, of course,
Yeah.
that you think you'd like to share that investors and listeners here should read.
Well, good one for people who are interested in business and public companies, I think, is a book called Flying Blind.
Mhm.
And it's by a Bloomberg reporter. I think his last name was Vance, or is Vance. And it's about the 737 MAX crisis at Boeing. The plane
Yeah,
that
of
they
course.
updated with they changed the engines,
That
put
they
software in,
rushed and
aerodynamics changed, software didn't correct it in the right way or whatever. I don't know the details, but 2 catastrophic crashes, grounding of the fleet worldwide. But he takes it back through the culture of Boeing
Mhm.
to the merger with McDonnell Douglas in the 90s,
Wow.
which was the other big U.S.
Yeah.
aircraft magazine, DC-8, DC-9, DC-10, MD-11, and military contractors. Well, and they merged. And McDonnell Douglas was more of a Wall Street company, and Boeing was more of an engineering company, proud of their engineering, and the 747 was like this unbelievable accomplishment. In 1970, Joe Sutter was the granddaddy of that project, and that revolutionized air travel because it made it cheaper because you put 400 people in a plane.
Right.
It was cheaper. It changed air travel for everyday people, not to mention all their other aircraft. Proud company. And then with McDonnell Douglas, it was really a McDonnell Douglas takeover of Boeing, and therefore McDonnell Douglas culture and a Wall Street culture. And so everything became, quarterly earnings and engineering. You get the impression from the book that it took a backseat to they've come up with some fantastic, planes since the Dreamliner and the 777 and so forth. But the 737 MAX was a big problem. Now it's been rectified and so forth, and they're flying, and I fly on them and I don't think about it. But for those people who lost family members and it turned the airline industry upside down
Turned Boeing upside down.
Turned Boeing upside down.
It took them to the brink, practically.
Yeah. And Air Canada had to ground theirs. They bought a bunch of them, and airlines don't need things like that.
No.
They got enough trouble with fuel. They got enough trouble with COVID. They got enough trouble with war. There's always something, with an airline.
Oil price, everything.
Yeah. So it's a great book, Flying Blind.
Now, always last, but not least, is your favorite breakfast, and maybe a breakfast.
Oh, geez, I remember that. Yeah.
I remember that, right?
Yeah.
And I already know what you're going to say.
No.
I'm going to let you say it.
Okay, I go, wake up, starving. My wife's, you're obsessed with food, and I am.
Is that
I
right?
got to eat every 2 hours, one of those people. She likes to take her time. I walk a lot.
Okay.
But anyway, you've seen me out with my dog.
I have.
But anyway, we order this oatmeal from a place in Quebec.
Yes.
And it comes in a box delivered to the door in these big bags, like a 3-month supply. Or not oatmeal, granola. Sorry.
Granola.
Yeah. And it's very simple, not too sugary or anything like that. and I like some dried cranberries and sunflower seeds and other kinds of seeds, because seeds are apparently good for you.
Yeah.
And
Digestion.
a banana.
And
you
you
know,
put milk with it?
I don't put milk on it.
Just dry.
Dry. Yeah. And I have a coffee.
No yogurt?
I need a coffee. Sometimes I put a little yogurt.
Okay.
Yeah. But if I
What's the name of the granola place?
Bionique.
Bionique.
Yeah.
We'll
Yeah.
definitely
Go to
put-
their
We'll
website.
definitely put a plug of that. at the end. Howard, what a great time! What a great session.
Such a
You know,
pleasure to be with you.
what I love about this interview and your ability. I mean, you've talked about things that had nothing to do with banking, specifically about leadership in so many different companies in so many different ways. So thanks for your time. Do keep it up.
Thank
And I'm looking forward to the next one.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Great to be with you.
And thanks everyone for listening. We'll see you next time.